Okay, let's get started with our third panel of the conference, Gender and Field Experiments. I'm Karen Yee. I'm an assistant professor at Queen's University, and I'm going to be moderating today. This is an active area of research with obviously important policy implications, and so we're really excited to hear what our three panelists have to say about where the field is going next. So we have three panelists today. We have Gneezy, Corinne Lowe, and Olga Stoddard. Uri is a professor at the Rady School of Management at the University of California, San Diego. He's going to be giving a talk on individual differences and preferences. Corinne is an assistant professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. She's going to give a talk on lab field hybrids, blending lab control with field incentives in experiments in the US and Zambia. And Olga is an assistant professor at Brigham Young University, and she's going to be giving a talk on strength in numbers, a field experiment on gender influence and group dynamics. Okay, so you guys know how this works by now. Each of the panelists will have 10 minutes to give a short talk, and then we'll have 30 minutes of Q&A. I'd like to have a discussion, so we'll keep all questions to the end. So please write your questions in the Q&A and vote on questions that you'd like the panelists to respond to. And feel free to specify if the questions are for one panelist in particular or for all panelists. Great, let's begin, or you can start.
Thank you. Apparently we had a different perception of what being on the panel means. I'm not going to talk about the paper or data, I'm going to talk about philosophy. And let's see how it connects to what other people are saying. My interest in gender differences started by a mistake, by an accident. I was a young assistant professor at the Technion in Israel 20 years ago. And Daldur Rustukini and I wanted to run a follow-up experiment to our incentives studies, and we wanted to look at competition. So we invited groups of 6 students to the lab. They had, the task was to solve mazes on the computer for 15 minutes. They received some shop fee, and then they were told in the first treatment that they'll be paid, say, $1 per maze they'll solve during these 15 minutes. And we wanted to compare this to a competitive treatment in which we had the winner take all. So one person, the person that solved the most mazes, will win, will get $6 per maze he or she solved, and the rest will just get their show-up fee. If there are ties, you break them up. That was the idea, no gender in mind, nothing like that. I was young and poor. I didn't have a research assistant, so I ran the experiment myself. And what I saw was actually very interesting. In the piece rate, everyone tried. But in the competitive incentives, in the competitive treatment, we saw that men were much more excited than women. So men became much more excited than in the piece rate, and we didn't see such an effect on women. From that, we started to think about gender differences. So now we made sure that we have a balanced group of 3 men and 3 women. Before that, I didn't even record the gender in my experiments. All the experiments I did during my PhD, I didn't even record the gender. I wasn't smart enough to do that. Now we made sure that we have balanced groups, that we actually take a good measurement of this. And we found indeed that men reacted to competitive incentives and women didn't. And that started at least my interest in the topic. Muriel Nidole joined us and we wrote our first paper on that in 2003. And after that, I kept working on competition, but then with Rachel Crossan, I was trying to expand it. We were trying to expand it to gender differences in preferences, more generally than just competitiveness. And I think that we documented some interesting aspects. And since then, you know, that paper was published 11 years ago. Since then, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of papers that looked at gender differences, and we know much more about the world. I think that we're still missing something, and that's what I want to talk about now. So we know a lot about gender differences in preferences. In general, we know about individual differences in preferences. In psychology, they talk about the big 5. It's not a new topic. The problem that I see is that we don't use it enough when we go to the real world and try to affect policy, try to have interventions. So 3 examples that comes to mind: if you are unlucky and have cancer today, you're going to be treated very differently than 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, every person with a certain type of cancer would have received the same treatment. Today, they move towards personalized treatment. They do, I don't even want to pretend what they do, but genetic testing, other testing, and they really try to target the treatment that they give to the person that they see in front of them. And talking with people in the field, they say that no question that that's the future of medicine in general. If you look at marketing, segmentation in marketing, if you want to say one important thing that we learned from marketing is the importance of segmentations and how to do it. When you open up your phone in Chicago now, you'll see something very different than I would see. If your interests are probably different than mine, everyone is going to see his or her own feed, and it's very different. And that's what tech companies are doing. That they try to segment the population, segment us, and target the intervention, the behavior change, whatever they want, whether we like it or not, they try to target it to us personally. On the other end, we see very, very little of this in what we're doing. We are not really applying it. One maybe example in the real world that is different is with financial advisors. In many places in the world, when you go to a financial advisor, the financial advisor has to first elicit your risk preferences. So they run some tests. Whether they're good or not, the surveys that they conduct is a different question, but then they try to adjust their recommended investment strategy to what they found out in this. But more generally, we don't do it in our interventions. And just to give you an example of why it's important to do it, I have this experiment with, I decided to go over my CV today and talk about it. I have this paper with Sanjeev Arot about white lies. And we look at gender differences in lying. And we see something that other people like Anna Draber already showed before, that when you have lies that help me as a liar but hurts the receiver, we call it selfish black lies, men are much more likely to lie than women, significantly more. However, when you look at lies that we call altruistic white lies, you see that actually women, those are lies that hurt the person who tells the lie but helps the receiver, you see that women are more likely to do it. Now, if you are tasked with reducing lies, the policy that you'll need to apply is going to be very different if you're talking about selfish white lies, selfish black lies, or altruistic white lies, or in general, maybe if you want to go after one population or the other. Think about one more example, but before that, we need to understand that when we go from the lab is a clean environment, sterile environment that we are controlling. We can do whatever we want. So the ultimatum game is actually replicable if you do it here or in Chicago or in Bonn. It's more or less the same because we are controlling the environment. Maybe it's different between population, but if you run the ultimatum game in a lab, we can replicate it in another lab. That's not true for field experiments. Field experiments are very different. It's cool, I can read my email while presenting. That's the first time. So the field is a much more complex environment, and it's not one size fits all, and we have to look at it. So the example that I have in mind over here, imagine that you want people to exercise more. You want to use incentives for that, and the goal that we would all want to have is to find the optimal incentives that would work always. So someone would come to us and say, I want to have these people exercise more. What do I need to do? And I can tell them X, Y, and Z. The problem is that it's going to be very different. The answer should be and has to be different to different population. Imagine that you have a group of young parents that want to exercise more, or you want them to exercise more. Over there, the problem would probably be that they don't have enough time. Now, another group could be elderly people, people that are in retirement homes and you want them to exercise more. Time is probably less of an issue for them. And we have to adjust the interventions that we do based on this. There is no optimal incentives, and we are still trying to find it. We're trying to find something that doesn't exist, and I think that that's a mistake. We should become much more like what the doctors are doing or what the marketing people are doing, try to personalize the interventions that we do, the field experiments that we run to the population that we have. So we need, in many cases, we need to run experiments with them, for example, before that to do it. Now, I know that many people are doing this. I'm not talking, don't come with counterexamples. I know about some of the counterexamples. I'm sure that there are more. But I think that 90% of the, I'm throwing numbers as if I'm the president, 95%, let's make it more convincing, of the field experiments that we see don't do it. Maybe they do it a bit more in development, less in field experiments, but in general, we should be much more aware of individual differences, maybe target our interventions to different people. I'm done. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So we'll move on to Corinne, and we'll do all questions at the end. Thanks.
have to unmute myself. Okay, so I wanted to go beyond just talking about a single paper and bring in a little bit more about a sort of general thing, that a theme of my research, which has been trying to blend the control of a lab experiment with the setting and the incentives of a field experiment. So I'm going to talk briefly about two experiments and then move on to sort of giving a bigger description of my work on incentivized resume rating. So the first example I want to give of kind of blending lab and field together is in Zambia, where we did a project. This was together with Nava Ashraf, Natalie Bao, and Kathleen McGinn, trying to measure the impact of teaching 8th grade Zambian girls negotiation skills. And it worked in the sense that our theory was that if we taught them these skills, this was a setting in which boys were frequently allowed to go to school and their parents paid the fees for them to go, but not for girls. And so we thought that if we gave girls the negotiation skills, they might be able to show their parents how paying for their school fees was a win-win. And it worked. The girls stayed in school for a much longer time, the girls who got this treatment. But we really wanted to understand why it worked. And in order to do that, we wanted to kind of replicate the decision to invest in child schooling in a lab experiment type game. But it wouldn't work to do that with like random people, because that's not what we were interested in. We wanted to see how did the treatment that we had given in an RCT affect this specific dynamic, and could we tease apart the channels through different arms the way you can do in a lab experiment. And so we brought the girls together with their parents into a lab and field setting. And what you see here on the screen is that because it was basically a trust game where the parents were endowed with some money, they could give it to the girls. If they gave it, it was doubled, but then they didn't know how much the girls were going to send back. But one reason you don't typically do trust games with family members is that the family can then undo that as soon as they walk out of the lab. And so our innovation to try to deal with that was that we created this Chuck E. Cheese store, which is what you're seeing on the screen, so that girls could immediately convert their earnings into stuff that their parents didn't want. They could convert it into lip gloss and, hair bands and, frou-frou girl stuff that wasn't going to actually help the household. And so there was really no way for it to be appropriated ex post. And, what we found through doing this is we were able to show that it wasn't just other incidental factors of our training that had somehow made the girls a better investment. It was specifically them using their negotiation skills on the parents, because we found that when the treatment girls were not allowed to talk to parents and played this trust game, they actually got less from their parents. But when they went and talked to their parents and explained how giving them more could be a win-win, because then they could send an equal amount back because the points were going to be doubled, they got more. And so we were able, through this lab and field, to really pin down the mechanism. So I want to give another example. This is from my job market paper, where my goal was to test the value of age, and thus what I call reproductive capital, basically women's fertility, on the dating market. But to make sure I'm really talking about reproductive capital, we need to be looking at age in isolation of other factors. So I need people to be matched on physical attractiveness, how fun they are at parties, but have different ages. So a traditional way to kind of study dating preferences in a field experiment setting would be something like a speed dating experiment. But I can't randomly assign people's ages in a speed dating experiment. At the same time, another solution could be just to put up fake dating profiles, but that would require using deception and kind of all the problems that came with it. So my solution was to recruit people who were on real dating sites and target them with ads. And the ad said, if you want to improve your dating profile, come participate in this survey. And when they jumped on over to the survey, what they saw is hypothetical dating profiles with randomly assigned ages. So that meant that the picture was being held constant, but just the age was changing. And for participating in this, rating these 40 hypothetical dating profiles, they were rewarded with advice from a professional dating coach on how to improve their own profiles in order to attract the type of people they were interested in. So the incentive was responsive to the behavior that I, as the experimentalist, wanted to see, which was them rating the profiles in accordance with their own preferences. The same way in a normal lab experiment, the cash incentive grows the more that the person tries to put effort into the game and actually kind of playing it according to the incentives that are on the table. And my finding from this was that I was able to identify that causal negative impact of age on the dating market for women, and in fact show that it was specifically driven by men who didn't have any children and who had accurate knowledge of the age fertility trade-off, and thus linking it back to fertility. So that same sort of framework I then brought over to the world of resume audit studies. So when we want to study discrimination in hiring, our kind of go-to methodology in econ has been the resume audit study, and that's where a matched pair of resumes is sent to an employer with just a different name that would indicate gender or race, or you could change other characteristics on the resume to kind of try to test something. But there's limitations of these studies. The first is that it relies on deception, which is something that in experimental economics we really try to get around, right? So it's nice because by using deception, you're able to bring it into the field setting and you're measuring the preferences of real hiring managers, right? We don't want to measure the preferences of college kids who would come to the lab. But at the same time, now you're giving up something we really value in experimental economics, which is being deception-free. And I think that that's not costless in the sense that, you know, once you have the market kind of flooded with these types of resume audit studies, then it might be calling back somebody when you get a cold resume might be more about trying to suss out which resume is real versus your actual interest in that resume. The other limitation is that the way you measure interest is just via whether the person gets called back by the employer. Well, it's actually a well-known fact in resume audit studies that unemployed people are called back at greater rates than employed people. Why might that be? Employers are trying to use their time wisely, and they don't want to call back somebody who's just kind of fishing for a salary increase at their current job, right? They've realized unemployed candidates are more responsive, and so they're more willing to go after somebody who's kind of recently unemployed. But if we then interpret that as being about the employer's interest in a candidate, we're kind of misinterpreting that, because it's not that unemployed candidates are higher quality, it's that they are more gettable potentially. And the last limitation is that because you can only measure people who are going to be responsive to cold resumes, you're limited in looking at the types of firms that hire that way or the types of positions that are hired for that way. So, you know, I don't know if anybody has ever tried it, but you can't apply to McKinsey by just kind of emailing your resume or sending it through Monster.com and hoping that you get called back. And so we weren't able to look at kind of the prestigious or high-skilled job market. And I think as a result of that, one of the findings of resume audit studies have been that there's actually very little gender discrimination. And in fact, a lot of times a positive gender preference, because often they're looking at administrative type jobs that might be kind of female typed. So the way we solved that together with Judd Kessler and our graduate student Colin Sullivan is that we wanted to preserve the world of the field and that we were working with real recruiters, right? And then we wanted to preserve the experimental control of the lab and that we could tinker with the resumes. So we asked real recruiters to rate fake resumes and incentivized them by using their preferences over those fake resumes to match them with real candidates. So this was all done at the University of Pennsylvania with UPenn Career Services. And so it's recruiters that typically recruit Penn undergrads. We say, hey, rate these 40 fake resumes, and then based on your ratings, we're going to use machine learning to give you real candidate matches that are a good fit for you based on your ratings. So we're able to get kind of that best of both worlds, the incentives of the field with the control of the lab. And so here's just an example resume that you can see. And then the way that we solved this other problem of, you know, just being able to measure callback is we actually asked them to rate on 2 dimensions. We asked them to rate both how interested they were in the candidate and the likelihood that they thought the candidate was going to accept their offer. And we found that both dimensions really mattered in terms of employers' evaluations. So just to kind of give you some warm-up results that aren't about, you know, gender discrimination, you know, for example, we were able to show here how much an extra internship matters in terms of GPA points, because we have GPA on each resume as the numeraire. And so we can convert the fact that, oh, you rated the resume that had a prestigious, you know, like a Goldman Sachs internship, you know, 0.5 points higher. What does that mean? Well, that's actually 0.4 GPA points when I do that conversion. So that means that you would take somebody who had that internship and had a 3.6, that would be equal to someone who didn't and had a 4.0. So we really wanted to look at, you know, diversity and discrimination. And this was a really interesting setting to do it, because when you're working with employers that recruit, you know, kids from Ivy League schools, they all swear up and down that they value diversity, that they place actually, in fact, a positive weight on diversity, which could mean that, you know, if there are 2 equal candidates and one is from an underrepresented group, you might actually boost up the candidate from the underrepresented group versus the candidate that wasn't. That was not, in fact, what we found. So we found across the board, on average, a flat preference for underrepresented candidates, so women and minorities, meaning they didn't, boost them up at all. But when we looked specifically in the STEM field, in employers hiring in STEM, we found a large negative preference for women and for minorities. And so we found that, a white man with a 3.74 GPA was equivalent to a woman or a minority with a 4.0 GPA. And, that's a big penalty, a quarter of a GPA point. And remember, everything else on the resume is the same. It's just the name that kind of indicates gender or race that's changing. And the employers themselves were in fact horrified to hear that they were doing this, because we think it was basically unintentional. There was also an additional effect, and it was something very similar to what was seen in kind of the classic original resume audit study by Bertrand and Mullinath, which is that we found that women and minorities were rewarded less for the quality on their resumes. So remember, I told you employers value those prestigious internships. Well, it turns out they value them about 40% less when it's on a female or a minority resume. And, this is across the board. This is employers in both fields, business and humanities, social sciences, and STEM. And, our theory on that was that we thought that, they were taking it as a mark of external validation. And if they had this worldview that people really valued diversity and boosted people up based on them coming from an underrepresented group, then you might think it's worth less as kind of a mark of your quality, a stamp of your quality, if you're coming from an underrepresented group and might have gotten that boost originally. But of course, the deep irony there is that we didn't find that to be the case, right? We didn't find that they were boosting those candidates up. And there's one more finding we had that was in line with that, which is that we found that they also thought that female and minority candidates were less likely to accept their offers, holding quality constant. So, for some reason, they think these female and minority candidates are in super high demand. And as we talked about with calling unemployed candidates more than employed candidates, that might lead employers to say, it might not be worth it for me to hotly pursue the best, minority female candidate on the market because I might not be able to get her. So maybe I shouldn't put as much effort there, which could lead to another form of discrimination. So just to kind of summarize those results, what we found was consistent with people thinking that they valued diversity and therefore forming a worldview that was other people value diversity, so I should discount experience at prestigious firms because that might have been, awarded on a diversity basis. And I should think that female and minority candidates are less likely to be gettable. But of course, the problem with that thinking is that they didn't actually value diversity. And in fact, in the STEM fields, they had a negative valuation of it. And so, here we think that it's evidence that kind of your beliefs, your wrong beliefs that might be based on the fact that consciously you're not biased, but you have implicit bias that's undoing your conscious preferences, could have even further consequences. So we say this as thinking you've tackled your diversity problem could actually be making it worse. So just to wrap up, what I wanted to kind of do in this presentation was to show you how to tackle some of the most interesting questions in gender economics. You might want to move beyond both the field and the lab. Because in either setting, you might not really be able to manipulate what you want to manipulate in order to hold everything constant and then, see how people respond to that. And so what I've shown you is a couple different models for blending the field setting where you have participants from the field and you have incentives with real stakes with the control of the lab so that you can ask some of the most interesting questions. And, I ended with this example of hiring discrimination, where if we had just stuck with kind of the resume audit model, we might have concluded that gender discrimination was not really a big deal, when in fact, when we turned to the prestigious firms we were able to access with the IRR methodology, we found a lot of very, very pervasive gender discrimination. So thanks so much, and happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks so much. Next up, we have Olga.
Okay, can you see my slides now? Okay, awesome. All right, so thanks so much for having me, and thank you to the organizers, to John and Rob, for yet another great conference and for keeping this community engaged and connected through this challenging time. What I wanted to do with my 10 minutes part is to walk you through a recent field experiment as an example from start to finish, and highlight some behind the scenes experiences and lessons learned, which I hope will be useful to others in the audience, particularly more junior scholars. This is joint work with two colleagues at BYU, and to set the stage, in recent years, concerns about lack of female representation on various important decision-making bodies have led to a variety of both public and private initiatives to try to diversify things like academic panels, corporate boards, public commissions, and other similar groups. And the intensity of these interventions and initiatives has varied quite a bit. So for example, if you look at the EU countries that have passed legislation on corporate board quotas, you'll find that most of them are requiring at least 40% of female directors on the boards. Whereas in the US, in the only state that passed legislation on this, in California, the requirement is very different. It's 1 out of 5. And in fact, we find there's some early evidence showing that many California corporations have chosen to comply with this law by simply adding 1 woman to their previously all-male boards of directors. And as you can see in this picture, this doesn't just happen in corporate boards, but in many other contexts as well. So what we wanted to find out is how does the intensity of these programs affect women's participation, women's influence, because presumably these interventions are meant to bring women's voices into to the table to affect the important decisions that are being made in these groups. So what happens to these lone women in male-dominated settings? Do they face barriers to contributing their expertise, their perspectives, even though they have a seat at the table? And in general, how do their experiences compare to the experiences of equally qualified women who are in the majority in their particular groups? So to answer these questions, we conducted a field experiment with a top 10 accounting program in the US. This program, like many other programs, particularly MBA programs worldwide, relies on a team-based approach where students are placed into teams of 5 and they work extensively throughout the semester in those teams. In our sample, we found that students work about 25 hours a week or more in these teams on assignments, on cases, on a variety of things, and interact socially both inside and outside the classroom quite extensively. I should note that the women and the men in this program are equally qualified. This is a very competitive program, and so the GPAs, for example, are pretty much equal. There are no statistically significant differences in their background preparation for the program or their prior leadership experience as well. One other note I wanted to make here is that actually finding a partner, an organizational partner, was probably the most challenging part of this experiment or of this particular research project. Back in 2015, when the project began, I contacted literally dozens of programs in the US, MBA programs, accounting programs that relied on these team-based approaches. And you know, for one reason or another would get turned down until finally this one program was interested. And the reason they were interested, as I found out later, is because they recently had an external evaluation completed, which strongly encouraged them to reevaluate how they assign students into groups. Traditionally, because women are about 25% of the student body in this program, they would place 1 woman per group or per team to try to dilute women and expose men to interactions with women in professional settings during this program experience. And so the lesson here that I would say is don't give up. More often than not, when you pitch an idea or pitch an experiment, particularly when working with the firms, in my own experience, it's not the first and even not the 5th firm that will actually, you know, bite or get sold on the idea and want to partner. And often it takes months and sometimes even years in the case of one field experiment, building relationships of mutual trust and respect such that an experiment can actually be conducted. Okay, so moving on to what we actually did, the program allowed us to assign students into different gender compositions. So we randomly assigned students into groups where women constituted a majority, so 3 women groups. Remember, these are groups of 5, so there are 3 women and 2 men, which we're gonna call 3F groups, or 1F groups, which consisted of only 1 woman and 4 men. So women are clearly in the minority here. Because there were more men in the program, this also necessitated creating several all-male teams, which we use in some of our analysis. One other note here is that the program was very averse to assigning 3F teams where women were in the majority. Again, for the reason of trying to dilute women and having more men interact with women throughout the program, they were very worried that assigning 3F teams would lead to more men being in all-male groups. So after a lot of convincing, the compromise we arrived at is to ensure that the men who didn't have the opportunity to be exposed or to be in a group with a woman in the first semester would have that opportunity in the subsequent semester. So the lesson here is don't be creative. With field experiments, there are going to be many roadblocks, which will require you to find creative solutions that will still be, not compromise your internal validity of the experiment, but be suitable and feasible for the research partner. Over the course of that semester, so for a period of 4 months, we then collected a variety of outcomes about these students. We had very extensive baseline and exit surveys. We had peer evaluations on a monthly basis where students evaluated each other. We brought them into the lab twice a semester, once in the very beginning when teams were first assigned, and the second time at the very end, because we wanted to see dynamically, is there a change in these various outcomes that we measured. And then we also had a bunch of administrative data like grades and job placements that we also collected in cooperation with the program. Back to being creative, the program was very averse to having students come into the lab on top of already very busy schedules that these students had. And so again, after a lot of convincing, we compromised and convinced the program to replace some of the existing team building exercises with the lab activities, which were crucial, turns out, as you'll see in the results, for us to identifying very nuanced results, as well as exploring a bunch of mechanisms. So I'm going to give you a very high level overview because I'm sure you're dying to know what we found out. So this is one of our main results. Let me tell you how to interpret this. So we're looking here at peer evaluations of influence within the groups after they had just completed this collaborative team building exercise in the lab. We asked, who is the most influential member of your group? And these are the shares of votes for women divided by the share of women in the group. Because remember, we have different number of women across the 2 conditions, the 1F and 3F. And so 1, the dashed line of 1, would mean that women are proportionately being selected to be influential given their composition in the team. And what we find is that in both conditions, women are disproportionately less likely to be voted as most influential, but this is especially true when women are in the minority. The lone women groups, in the lone women groups, women are extremely unlikely to be chosen as most influential. The opposite is true when we ask for who is the least influential member of the group during this discussion. And we find that women, again, the lone women are disproportionately more likely to be chosen to or voted as least influential relative to the female majority groups. Now you may say, well, these are just perceptions of influence. What about some incentivized decisions? And having a lab activity allowed us to have an incentivized decision where students selected what we called a spokesperson or a leader of the group. This decision was incentivized because the leader was in fact within a week was supposed to present the results of this lab exercise and would earn money if they did really well for their team members. So groups were incentivized to select the most competent leaders. And again, the same result is confirmed where women in the minority, when women are in the minority, they're much less likely to be chosen to be the spokesperson for the group relative to the female majority teams. In addition, having the lab allowed us to explore a number of mechanisms. We recorded students' interactions in the lab, which allowed us to measure women's sort of leaning in behavior. Are they even participating in these discussions? Are they contributing to the process? And in fact, we find that women in the minority female groups spoke no less on average than the women in the majority female groups. And so it can't be explained by leaning in. It's not that women aren't leaning in enough. These competent women in our sample were already trying their best to contribute their ideas and expertise, and that those contributions were not converting to influence as much as they were for the women in the majority or the men in the sample. We can also rule out that this is driven by the competence on the task, because we could measure very precisely who does well on this task individually and what people bring into the table, so we can rule that out. And finally, we could measure that these differences that we observe are not driven by women's propensity to vote for themselves or by homophily, which is, you're more likely to vote for women when there are other women in the group. To conclude, I would just direct your attention to the panel on the right, which is some suggestive evidence of some good news here. Which is that we find that over time, when we look at these monthly peer evaluations, that women are able to build influence, particularly women in the minority, the 1F groups, are seeing sort of this buildup of influence over time, such that the gap seems to be closing at the end of the semester compared to the beginning of the semester. However, these are really noisy, and you can see the confidence intervals are so much larger than we were hoping for. And the reason for that is because our experiment got cut short. We were planning on 3 years, and at the halfway through the second year, the program wanted to see some initial results. And when we presented those results, they decided that they no longer wanted to assign women into 1F groups, so we didn't have the third year of the experiment. This was of course unfortunate for us, but fortunate for the women who in this program who are now having a better experience, not being the only woman in the group. So just to summarize, I know out of time, we find across a variety of outcomes that women's influence in teams is devalued when they are in the minority. They're ranked less influential. They're also selected as a spokesperson much less often than when women are in the majority. And this influence cannot be explained by self-votes, homophily, competence, or leaning in. We find some improvement over time, but only in these general evaluations of influence, not in task-specific evaluations. I will stop here and stop sharing the screen. Thank you.
All right, thank you guys so much. Those were 3 really good talks. That was really cool. So now we're going to have a discussion. Uri, if you could come back to the... Great. Okay, so we're going to take questions. I have some prepared questions, and we're going to take some questions from the audience. So while the audience is typing in their questions, I'm going to start with some questions and give you guys some time to type in questions and vote on ones that you'd like the panelists to respond to. Okay, so let's start with some questions. So this one is for Uri. So I sent you guys questions beforehand, and you answered my question partly, I think, which makes it my job a little more difficult. But I think I still want to ask you this, which was, so I think you gave a fascinating talk about how intervention should be tailored to individual preferences. I think that was really interesting. But given that there are still gender differences and preferences between women and men, do you think there's anything we should do to close the gap? So you could think of other interventions, for example, like changing women's preferences early on or changing the environment. And especially the case of, since you find in some of your research that, you know, it may be driven by nurture and not nature. Does that affect things?
Thanks for the question. So I think that I can start by saying that I think that lean in is one of the worst things you can do. So lean in basically says is that it's a men's environment and women should adapt to that. So think about, say that in our panel up there, I see John and I see Yana. I bet you that John is much more likely to be interested in baseball than Yana, right? I'm willing to put my money on it, partly because I know more than just guessing, but let's say that American men are interested in baseball. Let's say that women are much less likely and non-American are much less likely to be interested in baseball. Now, building on Olga's talk, imagine that you go into a group filled with white men that talk about baseball all the time. Lean-in would say, well, you need to learn about baseball. So you start looking at statistics from the 80s. I cannot think about something more boring than that. And I know that my accent is perfect, so you wouldn't know that I'm not American, but I'm actually not American, and they couldn't care less about baseball. So my solution to this, back in the good old days when we could go to lunch with other people, to make sure that there is at least a couple of non-American men in the group, because I knew that if I'll be in the minority, it's going to deteriorate very fast to talking about this nonsense, right? So that goes to Olga's talk. Instead of changing me into liking baseball or a woman that goes to a company and wants to talk about something, diversify the team. That's the best. So we have a quota for our American men in our group, and now we try to avoid getting over this in our lunch group. Here's an anecdotal example. Until now, I'm 19 years as a professor at the US, and my deans were always white, 70-something-year-old Christian men, all of them. And now for the first time last year, we got a woman much younger, she's in her early 50s, my age, Hispanic, as different as you can think from the other. I bet you that the chance that when I'll go to have lunch with the dean and a couple of other professors, the chance that they'll talk about golf is much lower, right? And I know nothing about golf, again, because maybe I'm not a good man. The point is that diversification is what really makes the change. And some of it I don't like. So I have different preferences that might be closer to the old dudes that were my deans before. So I want to keep it as is because I kind of like the way it is. Maybe, I don't know, women like to serve different food in the faculty meeting than men like. I'm making up stupid things, but still, I don't think that women should change. Women should not learn about baseball or golf. They should. The environment should be such that if you want to talk about golf, go and talk about golf with your friends. But it's not an entry ticket to this environment. Another anecdote related to this dean: since she came last year, she hired about 10 new people, faculty and staff, and all of them are women. Now it could be affirmative action, maybe, but it could also be that as a woman, a talented woman, you prefer to work under a female dean that you think will be more sympathetic to whatever it is that you care about than under a male dean that may be less sympathetic. So I think that the direction is not to lean in, not to change the preferences of women, not to try and change the preferences of women, but rather make it more diverse and more open. The different preferences could be like this. I think one last example, think about the way at least men dress up for work. If you're in a consulting company, there is a uniform that you have to wear. And the uniform, the suit and the tie and everything is what white old men like to wear maybe, but that doesn't mean that that's what we should have.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. Okay, so the next question is for Corinne and Olga. So the question is, in both of your papers, you find that people are slow to update their beliefs about women's quality. So in Olga's paper on gender composition in groups, you find that it takes a few months for token women to be perceived as influential. In Corinne's paper on incentivized resume rating, you find that there's a lower return to high quality internships for women. Why do you think this is? And do you think people have lower priors about women's quality, or is there something going on with the updating process?
Do you want me to go first, Corinne? Yeah, so that is true that we find that women are able to build influence over time, at least in the generic evaluations of influence. So these are the monthly peer evaluations. We do not find that in the lab. So we did the lab in the beginning and end of the semester, if you recall, and we didn't find any differences over the course of 4 months. So women in the minority female groups are just as unlikely to be chosen as influential 4 months after they've had these interactions with their group mates as they were in the very beginning of the semester. But the generic evaluations evidence definitely points to what you were saying about biased beliefs. And there's other studies that have been done. So I'm thinking particularly about Alex Imas's study, and of course Corinne's work, which have pointed to this idea that dynamically these beliefs can change. So in Alex Imas's study on GitHub, they look at these postings by women and men and how they're evaluated, and they randomize the gender of the poster and find that when women post something technical, they get much lower evaluations when they have no prior record or prior evaluations. But once you can see that they have prior evaluations, they're ranked even higher than the man. So there's an updating in beliefs that happens as you see that this woman, is in fact credible and has been evaluated. So I think there's definitely evidence echoing the fact that it's that biased beliefs are really driving a lot of these results, oftentimes.
Yeah. So what I would add is, we kind of have this awareness that there's problems with using machine learning for hiring because, machine learning algorithms are trained on historical data. And so if historically there were a lot of white men in this position, it might be looking for some things that are really correlated with being a white man, whether or not that actually means that you're qualified. And I think we need to turn that awareness to human decision makers. We're also historically trained algorithms, right? And so if you're doing something like screening a resume, which you only spend 45 seconds doing, your brain is going to end up drawing on that historical data that you have that typically engineers have been white men, whether you're conscious of it or not. And I think that's why it's so important, to be conscious of that and to think about settings that can kind of eliminate that dependence on historical data and sort of be more objective about the current criteria and qualifications that are in front of you, not just to kind of get rid of that initial bias, but also to get rid of this kind of pernicious echo effect where because there's a gap between how we think we're making decisions and how we're actually making decisions, then we form these other beliefs that are like, oh, it's easier to be a woman, in X and Y fields, where we then see could lead to downgrading even further because, oh, I don't think your internship is worth as much, or I don't think you're going to accept my offer. And I have to say, I hear that all the time, people saying like, oh, now women get all the jobs, or now this, and that just isn't true. Empirically, that's not actually true because the measures to counter the discrimination don't make up for the actual discrimination in the first place, but it shows another way where sort of our beliefs the gap between, who we think we are in our practice and our beliefs can be very problematic.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. Okay, so I'll take a few questions from the audience, and I also have other questions for you guys too. So here's a question. Some students and junior researchers are discouraged from studying gender-related questions, especially if they are women. What are your thoughts on this issue?
I don't know what's the empirics behind it. When you look at the literature, you see lots and lots of papers on gender differences and discrimination. So I'm not sure that it's true. Maybe it was true. I don't think it's actually true today. So if the person who asked the question has something in mind, I'll be happy to. Well,
I do think that, as a woman who studies gender issues, people assume that you're kind of doing it for personal reasons in a way that they maybe wouldn't with Yuri. So, with my job market paper that was sort of about the value of women's fertility, I got asked all the time, like, oh, did you start thinking about this because you wanted to have kids and you're in an academic profession and like you were worried about this, you know? And I just don't think men get asked that when they study, you know, the housing market. They're not like, oh, is this because you wanted to buy a house? You know? So I think that there is, like, we can't say that there aren't some like assumptions that are out there, or there aren't, you know, or that maybe these topics aren't treated differently when they're studied by women who might be seen to have like a vested interest in this topic. But at the same time, I just don't think you should let that deter you. I think you should do what you think is great and important research on important topics. And women are people. And, you know, also, you know, specifically, I want to get away from, it's not just that women are 50% of the population, but also some of the things that are interesting in studying about women, like things like home production, produce a tremendous amount of value in the market that we should be giving equal attention to, the same way we care about how, you know, goods are produced, you know, in the manufacturing market, and we care about labor markets because of the tremendous amount of value that's produced. Think about how much we all invest in children as a society, and therefore what a tremendous amount of value is produced on the marriage market and through home production. And so to me, as economists, we should be giving those issues equal attention. So if you tell me who told you not to study it, I will go talk to them personally.
I would like to echo what Uri and Corinne both said, and just add that I was one of those women that deliberately during graduate studies try to avoid thinking about gender topics. And in fact, I wasn't as interested in it at the time. My cohort was about 50-50 split. You know, there were plenty of female faculty, so I wasn't in an environment where I felt underrepresented just as much as I do now, being one of the two female faculty in the Department of 25. And honestly, it was when I started here at BYU feeling for the first time in my life truly as a minority is when my attention shifted to these topics, and I really couldn't get away from them, I feel like. But it's been fun studying something that I feel passionate about and something that feels personal, you know, as Corinne pointed out, where I feel like it's been a feature, not a bug, but you know, I see why some people might disagree.
So if I can update my answers. So I think that I don't change my view about the outcome. We see lots of research done on gender, also by women, maybe more by women than by men. I do understand that there are differences in the way, so if I study gender, it's because of something else than if Corinne or Olga are studying it. The same as, you know, if I would have a kid during my PhD or during my tenure track, no one would have said that I'm not a serious researcher because I'm a man. But a woman that faces such a decision is going to get a much larger penalty, not just the physical penalty, but also the penalty from her colleagues that would say she's not serious. So there is a lot. So in terms of input to this, but in terms of outcomes, fortunately, we see a lot of research, I think.
All right, thanks you guys. I thought that was really motivational. Okay, so here's a question from anonymous to Uri, which is to what Uri mentioned about lean in. Are we then talking about a big push kind of experiments or policy so that the environment for women changes drastically so that women are incentivized to stay the way they are rather than being forced to lean in to be successful in a man's world?
I definitely think, sorry.
Go ahead.
So yes, the answer is that's my view, right? That the right way to do it is to change the balance in the workplace. And Olga's experiment is one great example to show it, that how, if you have, I really like the pictures that you showed at the beginning with, you know, the one woman, if she's also not white, that's great. We got all the diversity issues out of the question. That's not the right way to go. Because we are missing a lot. We're going to understand well the preferences of one type of people, but not of other types of people. And I think that yes, the answer is not to change it could be women, it could be Hispanic, it could be blacks, whatever the minority in this situation is, instead of changing them, let them have their own preferences and let everyone live with a more diverse environment. That should be, I think, to a great extent, our goal.
I think the question is actually asking, like, do we want policies that kind of drastically change the environment the way it is now? Because right now there aren't a lot of women in a lot of, fields or professions. And so like, in order to kind of have the diversity that you're talking about, you really need kind of a big change.
I think that what you need is more understanding to show, again, like the research that Olga did, like a lot of other research showing that once you change you diversify the environment, you get better outcomes. And then instead of, I'm not a big fan of regulation, so instead of regulation, maybe the people who want to make money in the company will understand that they're going to benefit from diversifying, right? So the university, even if I prefer to have a guy and talk with him, drink whiskey with him and talk about golf, it's better for the university. I understand as the chancellor that it's better for the university to have someone else also as a dean.
If I may just add a couple of things, as Rui was talking, that came to mind, that there is now quite a bit of evidence showing that it's easier to change, or it's more productive to change the structures and the institutions as opposed to changing beliefs. And that's certainly what our paper is showing as well. But you often hear this, especially when you're working with firms, saying that, well, this is out of our control. We just can't get enough women, right? There's only a very limited, sample of women we're drawing from for our IT positions. And so we can't do anything about that. And what I like to point out is there are still institutions and structures within organizations that are in your control, even if these longer term, more structural, issues like, the share of women in the pool of candidates are gonna take much longer to solve. You can still control a lot of these different factors internally. In our experiment, you can control how you assign women into groups, right? That's a direct policy implication. There are many other structures and more formal and informal institutions that you could control. So I have another experiment in the field where we're playing around with virtual meetings, and we're experimenting and randomizing the gender composition of those and trying to see who participates. Are women seeing these gaps in influence and participation in virtual meetings as much as they do in in-person meetings? And there you can vary a lot of different things. So there's informal rules on who gets to speak first, who makes the first comment, when a group leader is sort of asking, or who gets called on. There's a lot that we do still have control over, is I guess my point.
Great, thanks guys. So I have another question for Corinne, which is that it seems that the pandemic has disproportionately affected women's careers, as research has shown that women have taken on a disproportionate amount of childcare. Do you think that field experimentalists could intervene or should intervene? And if so, how? Like maybe something with household bargaining?
Gosh, I don't know if I have anything to say about how field experimentalists could intervene. I think that something that we should just be thinking about is that home production is something that needs to happen. And I think because home production hasn't been given equal weight in economics to, goods and labor market production, we sometimes sort of haven't thought about, how does it happen and who does it, and in the depth that we need. And now we're seeing a crisis of that, because it turns out it actually takes high quality inputs to to make our children, right? Children are made through time, and that time, if it can come from somebody else, like a teacher, that's really helpful, because then people at home can put their time into their research. But if it can't come from somebody else, then suddenly that input needs to come from somewhere. And so I think we have had a slow building crisis of home production, because when there was the big decline in specialization, and you had women entering the labor market and kind of producing there almost equally to men, right? I mean, actually the gender wage gap is, to me, a reflection that women are producing almost equally to men in the labor market, and yet they're still doing so much more in terms of home production. And so we kind of didn't figure out, like, how does this other type of economic production get done? I think partly because it wasn't taken seriously as, like, it's not measured in GDP, right? Like these are units of economic production. When your child learns math, that's a unit of economic production. And so I absolutely think that, it's a problem that, we as society need to reckon with, and the pandemic has really highlighted it. And I think, one one way that I would kind of flip the problem for people, if you are thinking about experiments in this area, is that it's a reflection of how valuable women's time is at home, that they're putting those units of time in there instead of maybe putting it, into their marginal hour into their work. And so the question is, how do you make women's time, not so valuable at home? You can either have a good substitute for it, right? Or you can get somebody else to sort of provide those inputs, which would be maybe what you were addressing about household bargaining.
So here's one extreme example about that: pregnancy. The technology between men and women is very different.
It's not equal, exactly.
It's not equal, right? But what we get, the incentives or the discount that we get in terms of tenure clock or teaching is equal because of legal reasons. And that's complete absurd, right? Carrying a baby for 9 months is different than being next to a person that carried a baby for 9 months. It's just very different. I've been in one of these situations, and that's an example that you can't change that. It's not something that you can lean in and make the man pregnant. It's not going to happen. The second part is preferences. It might be that women really prefer to spend more time with kids than men. Let's say that that's true. And if you believe in evolution, you can easily cook up an evolutionary reason.
Preferences are isomorphic to skills in terms of how that would enter into a model.
That was too much economics for me, I'm sorry.
So as long as if women are more productive, they don't have to prefer it, they would still do more of it.
Right, but basically what I'm saying is that it's not that that women should spend maybe less time with the kids. If they want to spend more time, and some men want to spend more time, that's not the direction to go, I think. The direction to go is, for example, with regard to pregnancy, it shouldn't be equal. Men and women don't suffer the same cost. They shouldn't be compensated in the same way. And that's an argument that I haven't seen. So legal scholars decided, the law decided, and I didn't see a pushback from economists.
All right, if you guys don't have anything else to say about that, I think we're going to close the session and move on to a break. So we're going to have a short break, and we're going to reconvene at 12:40 p.m. Central Time for the last keynote of the day. But thank you guys so much. I thought that was a fantastic discussion. It was really fun, and thanks to the audience for participating. Yep, see you all soon.